Hi, my name's Julia Walsh, and it's an absolute privilege to present again to GAA coaches. The organisation is one of the most progressive with its commitment to evidence-based coach education and working athlete-centred practice. Just a little bit of background about me. I actually lived in Cork for 6 years and worked at University College Cork. And I come with 40 years plus experience as a coach, not in GAA sports, but in basketball. And I also have 20 years experience in academia, really looking and trying to understand what makes an effective coach. And today's presentation, I'll be really combining both of those. There's some learning that could have only ever happened for me with experience. And then there was the experiences that I've had that have actually informed my practice through my academic writing and my academic research. The title of the presentation today is really how do we move from what to why and how. Looks simple enough. However, it's actually it has been a real challenge for me, and I think it's really quite complex to move and understand what those movements look like, particularly if we look at where you are in your coaching career and at what point have you been able to, I suppose, move from starting with what as your decision making to moving to who and why, and then moving on to the what and the how. So I'm going to explore that today. I'm going to explore actually the knowledge bases of coaches, the decision-making of coaches, and how we get shift in what we actually do. And I thought I'd actually start with sharing my screen here to start with, really using myself as a case study with a recent experience that I have had. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, so I thought I'd start with the end, because I think that when we start with the end, well, any start is with the end, I think, with coaching. So I've just recently come off as a national coach for an Australian men's basketball team, not the Boomers as such, but another men's basketball team. And where we decided to start was with the end. That is and always will be now my practice. So things that we had to consider when we first met, and the team that I had working with me, I knew them very well. I had selected them because of the strengths that they brought to the team. So we actually didn't think the learning was going to be based as much around us as it ended up being. So where was our starting point? Our starting point here to understand the end was time. How much time do we have? How many hours do we have? How many minutes? How many seconds? We had to have a temporal understanding of what was in front of us. So we were going to the World Championships. I was appointed 18 months prior to that as the head coach of the team. And the amount of time that we had was 180 hours. Next point was, what were the major events leading up to it? We had one advantage, we had several advantages, but one of them was that the World Championships actually took place in Brisbane. So we didn't have to worry as much about the travel components. Our next decision that we made was around culture and values, and making sure that we were consistent with our messaging. And when I talk about culture and values, we only start that process because the athletes must be engaged in it if they are going to buy into that, the messaging. At that point then, it was actually having a look at the competition data, because if we're going to look at our selection as well. We need to know what the competition is. We need to know how it is and what we need to do to be able to compete against the other international teams. After that, the next thing was to actually then look at our pathways. So what is it that we are going to have to do from a tactical, technical, strategic, physical preparation, and psychological development to prepare the athletes, understanding that we have 180 hours. We also looked at the personal outcomes for the coaching team and making sure that there was role clarification for everyone. The next step then really was, what can we really do with 180 hours? We can't do everything, but now that we've got that information about how long we have, about our competition, we could make better decisions about what the program was going to look like and what we could do really well in that time. So the reason for, as I said, taking you through this was that for us, we needed to have a really good understanding of the when and the where, which is really the context that we were working in. That was the first thing that we had to understand. Then we had to understand the who was involved in this, and who were the people that we were, what was the shape of the profile of the people that we were going to be looking for this competition. Once we could clarify that, then we could start to look at what and how, right? And to do that, that took us, several weeks of working through that before we were in a position to even start. So when we actually look at, and as I said before, coaching, there's lots of models of coaching out there, and there's more similarity than there is difference when we're looking at those models. Things that we know about effective coaches, and look, there's even questions around the terminology. Is it great coaches, effective coaches, efficient coaches? And excuse me if I actually use a different one at some stage. But if we're looking at what an effective coach is, basically they need to know their stuff. They need to know their context, and they need to know themselves. But that's really quite simplistic. And here it looks like they're three different bodies of knowledge. But these bodies of knowledge also combine to actually impact each other. And it is where you are at your stage of your development that will really determine how you move forward and what you are comfortable with. And I think sometimes we forget that coaches themselves, if we look at, even the basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs, need to be comfortable with what they're doing. And just bear with me when I work through this. So this model that I'm showing you here, once again, it's quite a simple model here. It's some work from my PhD, where I was working with expert or effective coaches, and the discipline knowledge that they said was important to them over that time was their sport discipline knowledge. So when we're talking about our sport discipline knowledge, your knowledge of the sport, exercise science would be in there. Sport teaching knowledge or pedagogy, their ability to manage, their ability to teach. Contextual knowledge, understanding the context that they're working in. All right, and we will spend quite a bit of time on that later on, because I think that is one of the areas that we probably don't do enough work in coach education. And the other one is personal knowledge, know thyself, and the impact that you have on others. So if you don't understand yourself, it's hard to know how you are consistently impacting those that you are working with. But even when we look at those bodies of knowledge, what becomes important is understanding where the decision-making starts and understanding some of that decision-making for you. So do you start with the what? Do you start with the why? Do you start with the how? based on where you are at your stage of development. And that's not uniform. All right, for every person out there, your starting points will be different. But I can basically guarantee, I could just about guarantee that for most of you, though, you will start with in some place where you feel reasonably comfortable to move forward. Okay, and as I said, models are very similar. So some of you may have seen the work by Coed and Gilbert, and in their model, they have 3 interlinking circles where they talk about professional knowledge, interpersonal knowledge, and intrapersonal knowledge. It's not that dissimilar from this one. It's really just how it's been, some of the information has been categorized, where I've probably put some more of that theory and teaching into sport pedagogical knowledge. But once again, what we're starting to see here, it's more than just the what of coaching. We practice coaching in a social context, all right? And that the impact of the person on the people the impact of you, the coach, on those that you work with is immeasurable. You can be a facilitator or a barrier in that role. Just put this up here because I think this really encapsulates what coaching is about. I'm just going to give you a little bit of time to read that, but it was one of the quotes that I thought really explained the challenges that we have of coaching, the complexity of coaching. Because coaching is complicated, it's complex. You're dealing with multiple streams of data. And I think it's a little bit like sitting on a train, sitting on the top of a train where you're seeing what's behind you, you're there in the moment, and you're actually trying to also see the future. And you need to be able to evaluate everything that's in front of you there, behind you, and in the moment. And you need to solve problems. And as coaches, we are problem solvers. And we are never fully formed. If we think that we know everything or that we've seen it all, I think we have failed as coaches, right? It is a profession that is all-consuming. It's been hard to really codify because it is so different to anything else that we do. And I think, just let me get to the next one. Yeah, it is so different with even just the pattern of practice and competition and what's at stake, and the beauty of sport itself, in that it's unpredictable at times, at most times. All right, so what I wanted to just take you through here once again is just understanding. I want you to be able to understand yourself, and I also want you to, in some ways, be kind to yourself in where you are in your pathway and where you can go, right? Because it takes time. It takes time to evolve as a coach, and probably easy to become a textbook coach, but it is more than being a textbook coach. You do have to have your experience, and you need to be able to have your knowledge of coaching as well. But if we look at this model here and knowledge construction, I think when we start coaching, I would use the term a chaotic simplicity. We pick up pieces of information and we make that information in some ways fit our athlete rather than the other way around. I can still remember walking into the old stadium that had 9 courts and had some of our best coaches in the country that used to work out of it. And I would walk through, I had my plan, but I'd see someone else coaching. I'd grab that drill and think, yep, I'm going to go and I'm going to run with that today. And I'd go and make it fit my athletes rather than the other way around. With experience then, and don't see any of these lines as solid, they're more perforated than solid. With experience then we come into that, I think that we evolve into complexity. And in complexity, we can become overrun with trying to do everything for everybody at the same time, rather than being able to pick out what's important and focus in on that. That next stage then is that ability to be able to integrate our knowledge and to be able to use it effectively. And I think for a lot of really good coaches, that the stage of integration is where we get to, because I think the master coach is that one who's able to be able to absorb information, to be able to think about whether it's relevant, to be able to extract it, to be able to adapt it, to be able to throw it out if necessary. So, as I said, everything, as coaches, we're continually evolving. And the other thing is, I think with here, what I would overlay this with is that as coaches too, it's a social environment. So we're mentored. People show us things, we see things, and it is through that type of process that we actually move from one stage to the next, and at times back again and across again as well. So learning for coaches is socially mediated. So just getting back to our stages of development and where we start with our decision making, with the novice coach, and I've worked with people who are doing coaching degrees or a coaching stream or a physical education stream, and their strength really would be in the sport discipline knowledge and the sport pedagogy knowledge. Once again, that's a very safe place for them. They're quite good at that. They can run really good sessions. The players are busy, happy, good as such, and there is some teaching and learning, but the athlete may not be centre of that. Some of those other areas that I think take a while to develop are the contextual knowledge, and sometimes that contextual knowledge for the novice is just non-existent. It's not even in their thinking. Personal knowledge is another one that takes time to develop, and if we're looking at things like self-awareness, when I work with coaches and I work with other leaders in other areas, they tell me that this takes about 10 years. And as I said before, though, this model can change depending on where you start. So if you're someone that's worked in counselling that comes to coaching, you might find that your personal knowledge is the safe place for you, and you're really good in that space, and you really have good empathy, you know how to listen. But it might be that, your sport discipline knowledge is not as big a knowledge at this point in time. But I suppose the point is that we do tend to gravitate to where it's safe to start. And a bit of advice here is make sure that, if you're beginning your coaching career, that where your strength is, make it a springboard. Make it a springboard for learning, right? So that you need to go and explore these other knowledge base areas. Do not let those areas of strength end up being a pair of cement boots for you. Really, this is just, this diagram here just talks about what I just previously discussed, which is where the safe place is. And you may not be ready here to move beyond the what. What am I going to coach? That might be the major focus until you start moving to the next stage of your learning. But if we look at the expert coach and where the expert coach moves, the expert coach tends to have a really good, once again, temporal understanding of what's in front of them. But they also, context is where they're making their decisions. So when they are making decisions, they start with their context first and then start to draw in that information from those other areas and make decisions from that point. So in that contextual space then, and then the richness of that contextual space is those questions really of, who am I coaching? Who are these athletes I'm coaching? Who is that group that support these athletes that I am coaching? What are the other components within this environment that I need to consider so that I can navigate and be able to really work with my athletes to get them to those places so that they can actually demonstrate their potential. And what we know with I suppose the expert coach is that they also understand that success is rarely a direct path, all right, and that also with that temporal understanding, they know that they can shift, they can change, and they can adapt and still continue on a path to success. And I mean, there are questions there too about how they're defining success for them as well. Okay, the model I've put up here is it's a model for activity theory. If we talk about context here, to me, I personally use this model because it really expands the context and my thinking around the context. The model comes out of Russian psychology, so it's a bit Marxist in how it comes together. But I think as a tool for thinking, where it positions us as the coach is that our job as coaches, and this is the work of Vygotsky here, anyone that comes from an education background would be quite familiar with this. Our job is to make sure that our team, our people reach their outcome. All right, so we are going to, who do I coach? This is who I coach, and I'm helping them get to their outcome. I'm actually helping that athlete get to a place that they could not get to without my help. And I do that, I mediate their learning, and I mediate that through my language. We use technology now to mediate learning. We have training monitoring. We analyze our athletes to death in some cases. We've got our goal setting, we've got our training equipment, but we as coaches mediate learning so that athletes or teams can reach their outcomes. And that is the critical point of the, like, who am I working for? Who am I serving as a coach? But that context is far bigger than you and your team and or your athletes. And it can be impacted on by these other areas here. For example, and look, in the COVID environment, here would be a perfect example that at the moment there are rules that are impacting us and how we train and work with our athletes. There's your local club and their training expectations. There's rules around the sport itself. There might be the drug rules there, branding rules that you need to consider because each of those can impact the outcome. Then we have the community. Who is the community that surrounds you? So the coaching team would be in that, sports science team, medical team, but you also have your family, and it might be there are other people in the club that form this community. And division of labour, as I said, a little bit Marxist here. So if we're talking about the coach, who has what responsibilities in the coaching and the management team? And actually, how do you work together? Is there ambiguity there in what your roles are? So if this is helpful for anyone out there, please just use nearly like a coat hanger, a model where you can just think about how big is my context? What do I need to consider? Because any of these lines in front of you here can also become fault lines. So if we just take this example here, if there's a fault line here, there's a disruption between coaching staff or coaching and management, that will impact you, but it will also impact the outcome. Right? So when you are actually looking for where the issues are too, I think the model can help you understand your context. But as I said before, all of these, a fault line anywhere can impact what you're trying to do with your athlete to reach their outcome. So now just getting on to, I think, some of those other knowledge bases that we don't really or traditionally spend a lot of time in when we're doing coach education programs. And sometimes we have to navigate those spaces actually by ourselves. One of those is know thyself. And look, we've been told by forever about this, whether it's Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, or Suda, and modern day philosophers, we need to invest in knowing ourselves. And when we know as coaches that our job is to help athletes reach their potential, and sometimes reaching their potential for our athletes is that learning, that having to use your body can be a painful experience for them too, that you need to understand what impact you can have in helping that athlete get to that point. And I think really what I've learned from this space is that it is the space where you have to learn to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. Right, coaches, I think that have been successful for long periods of time, understand that space, but it's also a learning space for them as well. But who are you and how do you interact with your athletes will have the biggest impact on your athletes. Are you going to be a barrier or are you going to be a facilitator? And also, you may not know the impact you have on your athletes for years. Very few of us learn this overnight, I suppose, understanding ourselves. Some of us never develop self-awareness and the personal skills required to assist athletes to reach their outcome. And really, at the end of the day, people won't remember what you said or did. They'll remember how you made them feel. And really that definitely comes out of that personal knowledge discipline. We're in the business of helping people reach their potentials, and we work with humans. In some sports you're working with animals as well, but working with humans is really hard. Having humans change is hard. And once again, that COVID experience again, we have to have something that's really quite monumental sometimes to make us change our practices. And as I said, you need to understand what it is that you do when you work with your athletes. When we look at that personal knowledge too, and look, I could spend a whole lecture just talking about this, but these are the big rocks that we talk about. So things such as, your self-awareness. What is your self-regulation like? Being able to process information in a balanced way, in a considered way, and that relationship transparency. So key understandings of different aspects of self and how we relate to others. And what are your needs and desires and habits and everything that makes you who you are. And, we look at things such as, are you empathetic? Do you display empathy? Let me try that again. Are you patient? Do you show humility? Do you engage in self-reflection? Do you look at your own practice? What are your goals? What's your understanding of others? And I think I see this too often when the elite athlete, and we've all had those elite high performance athletes where you have to do very little and they pick up something really quickly, right? And they've always done that. And when they come back into coaching, they don't understand that the majority of us have to go through a process of learning. They don't understand why someone can't just see it and do it. And I've had to work with those coaches to help them understand that the path they took and the path the athletes are taking are very different, and hence it requires a level of patience and empathy on their part. How do you manage your emotions and actions? And what is the reaction to your emotions and actions? How do you self-manage yourself? And how do you deal with challenging situations? Right? Do you listen? I think that's listening is a skill that is difficult to learn and requires practice. A lot of us hear, but we do not listen. Okay, and I suppose the other one, I'm just probably a little bit out of order here, is building contextual knowledge here. And really, when I'm looking at tips for how you might start building contextual knowledge, and some of you are probably doing this already, are things like very early on have players fill out questionnaires. Fill out questionnaires that actually, yes, obviously we want to know something about their sport, their goals, why they're doing it, what they do, but you also need to find out about who they are. Who are these athletes? Find out about their families. Find out what do they do outside of their sport. If they're young athletes, where are they going to school? It's important not just for, I suppose, building that context, and it'll relate back to the last point actually, is that the more information you have about your athletes, the better decisions you can make, but also understand that in sport, communication will break down. It will break down with athletes. And if you do not know enough about your athlete to have alternative communication bridges, you will not be in a space where you can continue to talk to your athlete while those broken bridges amend themselves. And I can tell you with young athletes, if you stop talking to them, they think you don't like them. They do take it personally. Also have formal athletic meetings, right? So that athletes, you can see how they're going and see what direction they want to do. Have informal chats. And I know that David Parkin has presented to the GAA on several occasions. At one point when he was coaching at Carlton, what he found out was that when they did a review, the biggest thing to come out of the review was the coach-athlete communication. Players want to talk to their head coach. And he was only talking to some of the athletes, and getting back to that transparency, it was picked up by the athletes. And in this case here, what he ended up doing was having a spreadsheet that he made sure over a 2-week period that he went and had informal chats with all of those players, right? But he had to mechanize it to make sure that it happened. Also, with I suppose with your contextual knowledge and things like that, look at pedagogical models that lead to more player autonomy, so that you're actually able to watch players as well. We want to give them autonomy, but we also want to observe them when we do give them autonomy, and give them voice. Do they actually use their voice? And what can we do to enhance that as well? So part of that is our observation of them when we are creating these environments for them. In practice though, look, I think that as coaches, we evolve, and that at different points in time, we're there and we're ready to sort of dip our toe in the river and take some risk. But as I said before, we have to start to become comfortable with being uncomfortable if we are going to serve our athletes well. In those early stages of coaching, the what might be the best place for you to start. But as I said, springboard rather than a pair of cement boots. Becoming, and I use that word as in the becoming, a coach. Becoming a coach is uncomfortable, and you need to take those risks, and many of those risks are going to be located in the relational and social aspects of coaching. And our job is to find the hidden talent, and the technical coaching alone will not do this. And in a lot of cases, athletes, and especially some of our better athletes, could do this by themselves. So sort of getting back to that topic again of getting from what to why, or changing the order there of going from starting with what, is getting back to that, I suppose, that contextual knowledge of, you know, who are we coaching, who are we serving, and what are their goals. And that is a risky space when we go into that space, because we have to examine ourselves as well, and we have to examine ourselves as to how we're going to impact these people that we work with. You need to understand why you're coaching. You need to understand why, I think, your athletes are engaging in activity, and to respect that. I think when we know who athletes are, who we are, and why we are there, then we have that opportunity to engage in the what, and to do it really productively, which will always lead to the how. So when we talk about moving from what, I think it's a reordering of where we want to go. So once again, it's, you know, it's who, it's why, it's what, to the how. And we will make the better decisions for the athletes that we serve. So I get back to where I started with the end. I am now finishing. I am now starting with the finish. And I'll just tell you the story of Alistair Clarkson, who has coached Hawthorn AFL teams there. When they won their second grand final, on that night, he sent a text to the leadership team, the players' leadership team, and he also contacted all the coaches and management that were going to sit in here, and he told them all to be at headquarters at 9 a.m. the next morning after the grand final. Weren't happy about it. They turned up there, and what we know is that, look, if you're a great team and you win, everyone's watching you. Everyone's going to copy what you do. There will be less secrets out there. So what happened here is that they sat down, and it took them all day. And what Alistair Clarkson asked them to do was, at this point, we needed to look at what we were going to do to change. So they walked out at the end of the day with the 10 things that they all agreed on that were actually going to lead to change for the following season. So the end became the start. And just in finishing my story too, when we reviewed the end of our program and looked at what was probably the major thing that we had to do to be better at what we were doing to start the next the 4-year cycle, the decision was, we were a group of coaches that thought we'd come together, and I knew those coaches well. And we had done quite a bit, well, we thought we'd done quite a bit on risk and looking at what are the risks to the coaching team, what is the risk to the team when we go into a tournament environment. And tournament environments are very different from, you know, your weekly competition, and very quite stressful as well. And what we found and what we discovered about ourselves is that we hadn't done enough work there. And even though we had a facilitator in there that did that work with us, we felt that we needed at least another 3 sessions to really tease out how we were going to behave, not so much in getting our plan, but what we hadn't looked at was we hadn't stress tested ourselves in a stress situation, as in coaching, on court, competition. So for our learning here, we really needed to reflect about ourselves and how we work together and how we actually all individually worked with stress. So that really was that combination for us of having a better understanding of our context and about personally, in our personal knowledge, how we would work together better as a team. I mean, we got the silver medal in the Worlds. That's the best that we have ever done in this competition. But yeah, that's not our end point. it was one of the metrics, but we're still working towards another colour medal. But the outcomes and the success for our players as people were well and truly met, and that in the end, that was what was most important. Anyway, I'll open the floor up to some questions.
Thanks, Julia. That was a great presentation. Really, really engaging and really thought-provoking in lots of senses. So we have a few minutes. We might do a few questions for 10 or 15 minutes, if that's okay.
Sure.
One of the things I was struck by during your presentation and some of the other sessions we've had over the last number of weeks on this series is that novices can be overwhelmed by the different strands that appear to be relevant. You know, I thought it was interesting that you spoke about needing to go through complexity to reach simplicity. But that in itself is a sort of a perilous journey. And I think sometimes we lose coaches who get lost in that complexity and say, do you know something, I don't think coaching is for me because it's just too much. How can we support coaches to get through that?
I think, first of all, it's understanding it, that is actually what happens to us, and we can get caught in there. I think we need good mentors, and we need good communities of practice who can talk about that. And in some ways, it's a symbiotic relationship, that one between complexity and getting to elegant simplicity. And in some ways, you have to go through complexity to get to simplicity. So even the best coaches probably start in the mess of complexity, even in a season. And their job then is to extract simplicity for how you go forward. But I would think then it is the support of others around them that can help them with their reflective practice, as well as to asking them those guiding questions about, okay, what's really important? What could you simplify? How could we get some of these principles out? And sharing their practice with them.
Yeah, I think that sharing is important, and sometimes we believe that if we share, we're giving someone else the leg up that we might not have. But I agree with what you're saying about the communities of practice and so on. I think sometimes our clubs could really function as a real community of learning for the coaches within that club. Everyone in the coaches in the club is supposed to be on the same side, so you know we can help each other to become a little bit better.
Yeah, and I think though we probably want to frame it too, that we want to frame it about how do we help someone move, from those spaces of complexity, or how do we help someone who's starting out? How do we help them to make sense of knowledge, bring it together, and chunk it in small bits and help them navigate that pathway.
At the same time, there's nothing really wrong with the what either, is there? And like we speak about variety as one of the fundamental canons of coaching. Like the last thing you'd want to be as a coach is known that, we're doing this game, it must be 25 minutes before the end of the session. But we also know that knowledge of games and drills and exercises is really everywhere now. So coaches need to be a bit more than that. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with the what either.
I think the what's really important. It's where we position the what. I mean, we need to make good decisions, and the what should nearly drop out of it, right? So if we understand our context, and we understand who we're coaching and whatever, then we start to have a better critical eye in selecting what's important. And I think sometimes we select too much. We think about, how much are we going to deliver in this program? And we overdo it. And then we do not enough of anything. And with that too, then sometimes, it's not meaning making for the athlete. And I think that, and getting back also to that why, Peter, I think one of the really important things is, I think we need to be able to explain to our athletes why we are running with a certain thing. They need to understand what its connection is, whether it's their connection to their development, connection to a game scenario, or whatever, because I think the why is better engagement.
And I think that's a sort of interesting change that has occurred in the minds of lots of coaches over the last number of years. I suppose coaching was heavily influenced from we'll say, military type situations back historically, and even the language that we use of drills and so on is very much based on that. And there might have been a perception previously that players do what coaches tell them to do, and then we'll win or lose depending on how well they did what I told them to do.
Yeah, and that's, I call those people trainers now, really. And I think you're right. I think those historical models, and we still see them out there, still affect those people coming into coach, because it's the concrete stuff people see. And then they think that's how you coach. And I'll just give you a really good example of one of my students that I had. He was a fabulous young coach, so much so that other people came and observed. This is when I was in Cork. Other coaches came to observe his practice. And then he got a job in the club in a higher level, and because of his innovation. But when he went there, he went into the old style of coaching, because he didn't want to offend the elders of the club. Yet that's what got him there. So I think it's difficult. The safe spaces for taking risk and moving forward with your coaching. And I'm not sure I answered your question really well there.
No, sorry, yes, you did. But you told, I remember speaking to you before about that story, and it really stuck with me for a long time, on the basis that we sometimes fall into the expectations of what we think people expect of us. And one of the things I certainly have been grappling with over the last number of weeks on this series is the number of coaches and educators who said about chaos in coaching.
Yeah.
And I think we need to sort of reframe for a lot of people, especially maybe administrators in clubs or people who are not fully involved on the coaching per se, but are very often influencing coaching decisions that we make and what they understand coaching to be.
Mm-hmm.
And we've spoken so often on this series about coaches being comfortable in chaos or working on the edge of chaos. But very often those people that appoint us to roles or ask us to do jobs, their perception of what coaching is strict, restricted drills, cones, yep, lines, lanes, one after the other,
busy, happy, and busy, happy.
Exactly. And almost for a coach who wants to break through that sort of that complexity through to simplicity, you have to bring all the other people with you as well.
Yeah. And look, I've seen models like that in professional sport, where when the new coach comes into an AFL team and doesn't have a lot of power, and you have those people around them that expect him or her to coach in a certain way, but the experienced coach comes in and actually says, well, actually, I'm bringing in these people and you buy into my culture of how I coach, and it is different, but if you want me, this is the deal. So it's having the power to be able to do something different. And sometimes, when you're going into a club, you've got to do I call it your underwater knitting. You've got to get to people who have the power, and you have to sell them something so that they champion you and they back you up. Because when you take risks, there's often more fail before you actually get on and things start to change. So, yeah, and I think success too. Success gives you permission to do things differently. So you get held back in different ways. So it's a really challenging space. And we, unlike any other field, we have the critical eye on us all the time. And everyone's an expert, whether it's the parents sitting on the sideline watching, to the athlete, to, the fan watching on television. They can all become experts. And that is I suppose it's the challenge of sport. to be able to work in that space.
I think it's interesting. I've seen some stories and media recently about programs across various sports, for example, where for that reason the coaches or clubs limit people who are allowed to observe training. And I'm not sure that's the right solution either.
But I must say, Peter, as a coach, I've really enjoyed the COVID space to innovate with my players without having the critical eye on me all the time, because we've been able to actually work very much more as partners. I absolutely depend on the players for honest feedback about what's working and what's not, and they're getting voice out there. And I've also worked closely with them for things that they want to work on as well, so that, you know, apart from, you know, self-determination theory and things like that, you know, they want their competence and challenge and voice. And we've been able to do that very successfully in that environment, you know, which is difficult on, you know, when you're on the field, when you're on the court or doing that sort of stuff. So that's been one of the benefits out of it. And one of the benefits is that when I go back into normal practice again, the parents have already bought in. They like what they've seen, and the players like it too. So my fight for something different is it's not the same. It's good.
Yeah, and again, it's something that we don't really speak about on various coach development programs or initiatives. Obviously, COVID is not something that we might have foreseen in this sense, but that whole interpersonal thing that's there between coaches and club officials, coaches and parents, coaches and other support people. And it's interesting you brought up Coed and Gilbert stuff. We'd Wade Gilbert presenting here a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about this as well, with helping people to navigate that set of interpersonal relationships that they need to have as a coach, because it's not all about on-field stuff.
No, absolutely. Totally agree. It's a very complex environment that we work in as coaches, and particularly I think at junior levels. Because, you know, there's different goals there, not just for the athletes, but also the parent group. So in my sport, even during selection, what I've learned is it's not so much the kids, like we have 5 divisions, let's say, of under 16s. It's not so much about the players making the certain teams. Like, the players can actually adapt whether they're in a 1 or 2 side. The people who do not adapt are the parents, because they have their little social groups. They're like cells now, I think. I use that term, a cell, where each team becomes its own little cell. And for a parent to actually have to then go and be part of the number 2 social group is really difficult for them. So, you know, sport, it's wonderful, but God, it's a challenge sometimes.
Absolutely. I thought it was interesting as well, you brought up the know yourself element. My ancient Greek is not great, so I'm not going to try and pronounce the Greek version of it. But being comfortable, being uncomfortable is a really interesting concept. Like, coaches are vulnerable people. We're vulnerable in lots of senses. You know, once the ball is thrown in, it's limited what we can do. Certainly in Gaelic games, we don't have timeouts. As you do in basketball.
I'm the 6th player in my sport.
But, you know, we're limited in what we can do. You know, you can make substitutions and changes and you give instruction and so on, but you're really limited in your instruction. So you're vulnerable to what the players do. And I've spoken to a lot of coaches over the years, and they've said that they've sometimes been on the sideline and the player looks over to them, and the coach knows that the player is asking, what do I do now? And they're really struggling and limited in that. So even Brian Coed from Kilkenny spoke about it last summer, where he said he's as vulnerable as anyone else on the sideline. Yeah. After all the years and success that he has had. So that being comfortable, being uncomfortable is really difficult. Yeah,
it is. But, you know, I also think it's that sort of, it's the learning space. It's yeah, and it takes time to know that that's okay. And because I think in coaching, it can be quite clandestine at times, and we don't necessarily share that part of our practice, that we don't know that that's okay to be there. And that's it's part of the job.
And again, you're right. It's something we don't talk about on coach development programs. We'll do everything up to the warm up. We'll talk about halftime team talks and we'll talk about post game reviews. Mm-hmm. But for the 60 or 70 minutes that the match is on, we don't talk about it.
Mm. Yeah, and well, I don't think we do. We really, I think coach education has always been better at the more concrete things. The things we can see, the things we can measure, and the things other people have seen. And perhaps it's just when we need the help or assistance that some of those things surface.
And how would you advise maybe coaches to start talking about that, about being that, experiencing that uncomfortableness?
I would get more coaches to talk about it. And look, I would really, if I was working in the GAA and that, I would be looking at getting those people that people know and respect and get them to at least start that conversation about what that looks like. Because I think we need to know that it's a normal state. It's part of it. It's a normal state. Because only then I think will it filter down. Because as you said before, historically, the coach was the person, the captain, out there leading it, Custer, here we go, we're going into battle. And actually it was, sport was actually designed to prepare young men for battle as well. And those models still hang around us, though, of what it is to be a leader. But when you talk to those coaches who are consistently successful, we know that it is these are the people that actually have to relate to their athletes and do relate to their athletes, because their job is to open the door to the potential and not let their ego, let go of their ego as well in that space. Risky business.
I think very much so, but I think to follow on with the know yourself theme, we see that in a lot of management courses now and business mm-hmm. courses and so on, and self-awareness is so important, and knowing what you don't know, and these type of things that are there. But the image you showed is from ancient Greece, like I said, but it's interesting that there was 147 maxims written at Delphi, which is where that comes from. Mm-hmm. But know yourself is one of the three that was put over the entrance. So it was one of the most important three. Mm-hmm. So even back then, I think philosophically we knew that it was really, really important. So I suppose what I'm really trying to get at here is that how can we help coaches to know themselves? What are there tools or tricks or resources that are available to help people with that?
Look, I think we need to be able to say what it is and what is self-awareness, and even I think reflective practices helps us with the self-awareness, right, as a starting point to understand ourselves. I think we need to be able to understand and record how do we what am I trying to say here? How do we behave in certain situations? We are animals of habit. So do we act? What happens under stressful situations? Are we quick to whatever, or are we considered? I think there's probably some nice profiling that we could help coaches with, and prompts to help them think about that and learn more about themselves. And there's lots of courses now on, social, I suppose, empathy and listening and things like that. But you got to practice them. You actually got to practice them. And it's got to be open conversations. It's got to be out there. I mean, we wouldn't talk about mental health at all 5-6 years ago in the media. But we now talk about it. And people openly talk about it to help others. So it's once again getting to that point where that critical point where we actually, it's okay to have those conversations.
One of the things I think, again, is interesting over the last while, a lot of coaches decided to spend some time during this COVID period on profiling players and giving feedback to players about various different things. So one of our very early sessions involved helping give coaches tools for doing that, and having coaches think about the different elements to the game and to be able to consider a player's strengths and weaknesses against those things, and feedback to the player and try and chart a path to improve themselves and so on. But we don't really have equivalent things in a coaching context. So maybe, like you're saying, it might be just something for a collection or a group of coaches, whether they be in the same coaching group or maybe in the same club, to sit down together and in time sit down together and think and expand out about these things, about what is coaching and what does it mean and what do we do, and then to really give a good set of or a good opportunity to consider your own strengths and weaknesses in those areas.
Yeah. And as I said, and because it's about us, or personally about us too, it's that ability to be open-minded in those conversations as well when you're having them, which is a challenge in itself, I think.
Yeah, it is. And again, over the last little while, we've had a number of examples whereby, especially basketball coaches have been coming in to help out with Gaelic football teams, and Gaelic football coaches trying to learn from basketball and so on. So that sort of cross-sport learning and interaction could be important in that too.
And what we've found in Australia too is that in those, when you do have those sort of, you bring a group of high performance coaches together, that coaches from different sports sitting together are more likely to open up to each other than coaches of the same sport.
Yeah, and I was just actually going to ask that question. So, for example, maybe what we do is we say, look, I'll get my group of coaches here, and I know there's another group of coaches in a different code, different sport, different town, different whatever. Maybe we can have a discussion. And I've noticed that in this time, a lot of coaches have used things like Zoom and Teams to communicate with coaches far away, because they're not a threat right now. So whereas I mightn't talk if I'm the under 14 football coach, I mightn't talk to the under 14 rugby coach in the same club in the same town.
No, it might take your players.
Exactly. Yeah. But I might talk to an under 14 rugby or basketball coach in Australia, because they're not a threat to me.
That's right. Yeah. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think when we look at where sport is embedded, so I think, like Australia, sport is embedded within a club system mainly. There's a couple of sports that are embedded within an education system. And I think Ireland is the same. There's the club system is very strong. But when it comes to the United States, where sport is really embedded within the education system, and people actually that are coaching in schools and whatever must have an education degree of such and whatever. But because of the different routes and spaces where they've evolved from, there is much more sharing of information over there. I think that's part of being involved in it is a learning environment. So they've got some interesting coaches as well on the other extreme. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a really interesting sort of set of challenges that we have, and maybe one of the things for sports and organizations is to be less inward looking in these things, and maybe when we're considering coach development programs, that that we should be, exposing coaches to a variety of codes and backgrounds and sports and contexts, and providing the coach with the tools maybe to help them evaluate and consider things instead.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, or prompts, because I'm not, though I would look at things such as, Sophia Jalette has developed some really interesting tools around the coach-athlete relationship.
Yeah.
So there is some material out there, but have we really explored that personal development area? I think so, like coaches over here can actually do a leadership course at Melbourne University, like the high performance coaches in leadership. And I think they cover off on some of those things, because it is a space that other trades, other professions have explored. But the work and sport profession are different as such.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, Julie, you've been very good at your time. We've gone over time really, but I just wanted to finish up with a couple of questions, maybe on things that you can tell us about from your own experience. So I'm trying to think about, are there resources or materials that you might advise some coaches to look up?
Sophia Jalette, her work on coach-athlete relationships is important. Other things that I have been reading and looking at. So I think that's from a coaching perspective, that's an interesting question. And I'll tell you why, because I've really now gone into that sort of space where once a year I will really take on something and learn it to the nth degree. And just, if I can build up every year expertise on just one thing or one concept rather than trying to do everything. It works for me. It may not work for other people, but I know other coaches over here would do that too. Just what's the one thing I'm going to, how am I going to sharpen the axe on something? Resources. Look, I read widely, so I'm not going to get everything from coaching as such, but I would have particular coaches, if I know that they're talking or presenting, I would seek them out to listen to. And every now and then, I'll send an email to Eamon Ryan and ask him for advice on something.
Well, that's a very worthwhile email to send, to be honest. Eamon's still going strong, still coaching at the moment as well, I think.
Yeah.
So a lesson for all of us maybe to be more like Eamon as well, because he has spoken before about his own journey as a coach. Mm-hmm. And his own, where he started from to where he is now is a very, very different place.
Yeah. And it's nearly you. It's that evolution. You don't start as a great coach. No one does.
No. Okay. Julia, you've been really, really good with your time today and again over the last number of weeks in putting this together. I know you're just finishing up a big correcting season, so you've been involved in a lot of that for the last number of weeks. So thanks very much for putting everything together for us. We really, really appreciate that. And thanks very much.